The sound of the pomp and ceremony of Tynwald Day, the annual celebration on the 5th of July. The state trumpeters announced the arrival of His Excellency the Lieutenant Governor in Man 1, the official car, accompanied by police outriders. He's met at the Tynwald Field in St John's by two captains of the parishes. He inspects the Guard of Honour and the military band. He lays a wreath at the National War Memorial. He attends a service in St John's Church and then walks along the ceremonial walkway, preceded by the Manx Sword of State, to take his place on Tynwald Hill to preside over the ceremony.
Learned Deemsters, I exhort you to proclaim to the people in ancient form
and then,
such laws.
well, many of us will hardly see him again until next year. What does he do? Why is he here? He doesn't preside over the sittings of Tynwald in Douglas. As governor, he doesn't actually govern. And yet, for every 5 years that a governor is here, the Manx taxpayer shells out something in the region of £2.5 million to support his tax-free salary and the expense of running Government House. There's no doubt that if you're coming to the end of your career as a diplomat or someone in the military service, 5 years at £108,000 means a comfortable tax-free £500,000 in the bank as you retire. Next week, a new Lieutenant Governor will be sworn in Castle Rushen to begin his 5-year term. And I thought it would be an appropriate moment to ask that question. Why do we need a governor? So, to begin with, a little history. Only a little, nothing to worry about, but just a few words to put the whole issue into context. We've had governors on the island for hundreds of years, and for most of that time they did actually govern. But in 1765, things changed forever, as historian Derek Winterbottom, who's written the definitive book on governors of the Isle of Man, explains.
Well, the fact is that in 1765, the British government got completely fed up at last with the fact that the huge smuggling operation that was going on in the Isle of Man was defrauding the British Treasury of what today would certainly be billions and billions of pounds. And so they took advantage of the fact that the new Lord of Man was a very young Duke of Atholl. They said to him, "We will support you if you will sell us your royal rights to the Isle of Man, or your sovereign rights." And they offered him £70,000, which doesn't sound much, but anyway, they took it. In 1765, King George III resumed the sovereign rights of the island and also the right to run the customs, which is really the important thing.
So the title Lord of Man ceased to exist, and the British government installed their own governor on the island, having bought out the rights of the Duke of Atholl. The governor, in these early days representing the Crown on the island, was extremely powerful.
Perhaps the most famous governor is Henry Locke. And during his period of office, the island became a very busy place, lots and lots of tourists and so on and so forth. And this increased enormously the role and power and position of the governor, so that Locke's successor, whose name was Walpole, wrote a book in which he said that the powers of the governor of the Isle of Man were actually almost autocratic. And this autocratic view of the job was continued by his famous successor, Lord Raglan, who was very autocratic. Now, he was so autocratic that after his death, the British government realised that it had to find somebody much more easygoing and prepared to introduce reforms. So from the 1920s onwards, reforms were gradually introduced, and the governor's power gradually declined.
As the power of the governor declined to what it is today, the question surely arises, why do we need a governor?
Well, we need a governor because the Queen is the sovereign of this island, as long as the island remains not an independent republic. And as long as the Queen is the sovereign, she needs a representative. She needs to be represented here as the head of state.
As long as we're not a republic. Do we want to be a republic? Do we actually want total independence from the United Kingdom? One person to ask is someone who once had the opportunity to say, yes, we do. And that's Tony Brown, former MHK, former Speaker of the House of Keys, and former Chief Minister. Someone who's taken a deep interest in the constitutional development of the Isle of Man over many years. Were we actually offered independence?
Well, I think first and foremost it was an inquiry by government at the time in discussions on many issues to do with the Isle of Man, and there was sort of moods in the community about, independence, needing to have greater control over our own affairs. And the question was asked, and the UK government said, well, if the Isle of Man, and that means the people, vote that they want independence, then they wouldn't stand in our way. And I think that's still the policy.
So why wouldn't we want to be independent?
Well, I think you need to be clear why you do want it. The Isle of Man is in a quite unique position. We have a very good sort of constitutional structure, really, where the Isle of Man, as a Crown dependency, of course, controls itself internally through its elected representatives and through Tynwald. And also, of course, if you look at what's happened in the last 30 years, massive constitutional changes have happened where we've had the development of Chief Minister, a Council of Ministers, transference of all or many of the powers that the Lieutenant Governor used to have to the Chief Minister, the Council of Ministers, to Ministers or the Governing Council. So the actual influence over the direction the Isle of Man goes has changed substantially, that we're not far off being fully independent. It just means we haven't made that last step. So you'd have to work out what is the benefit of that last step, really.
Not everyone is as relaxed about the current situation as is Tony Brown. There is a Manx nationalist view that there shouldn't be a governor at all, even if that did mean becoming totally independent. To hear that view, I went to see former MHK and Minister for Education, Mrs. Hazel Hannon. Still active in politics, although not an MHK, she's the chair of Peel Commissioners and has strong views on the idea of a governor.
I think it's very much out of date. I don't think we should have a governor, but I have to say the Isle of Man has gone very English in its outlook. I don't know what Tynwald and the government are doing, but a lot of the things and they're very subservient to England. They don't seem to be standing up to Westminster. We don't need a governor. We have communications in this day and age. I can't see why government can't work with government. So you've got the Chief Minister who can liaise with a government minister, not a government department, liaise with a government minister. And then you can get rid of Government House. The money that we'd save, it's not peanuts. What I wanted was that site to be used as the incinerator. It was perfect. It was outside the TT course and it was within 2 populations, which was absolutely perfect.
Well, perhaps a slightly controversial idea, but putting that aside for the moment, without a governor we'd have to be independent. How would that work?
Well, like I've said, I think we've gone very English in our outlook. I don't know why. A lot of the legislation is just, it's passed in the House of Keys. I don't think it's questioned about why it's English based and not going through it to amend it so that it's Manx. I think it's a halfway between being totally independent, because you have to work at that, and then it would lead on then to becoming more sophisticated.
The thing is, though, if we were to become independent, wouldn't we have to sacrifice our VAT agreement, introduce border controls, and lose the reciprocal health agreement?
We don't have a health reciprocal agreement. We have to pay for the health that we receive. The only thing that you can have is emergency treatment. After that, everything is paid for either by the taxpayer in the Isle of Man or by insurance. The VAT agreement, yes, but we do have our customs and excise people here ourselves, and I think they have to do much more than they used to do. With regard to passports, passports are now much more user-friendly in that they're electronic, and so that from that point of view, that would be a lot easier.
However, the issue of independence is not currently at the top of many people's lists. In fact, the status quo concerning the governor seems to be unchallenged at the moment, though there was an incident some years ago when Tony Brown thought it was time to look at the tradition of calling him a governor, even though he doesn't govern, and maybe call him something else. In 2003, a proposal was put forward to rename him Crown Commissioner, and by all accounts, Her Majesty the Queen indicated that she would have no objection to this if the people of the island agreed. Tynwald approved the motion, and it was all set to go ahead, but, it seemed, the people of the island didn't agree. There was such an outcry from all sectors of the community that Tynwald reversed the decision, and it never happened. What had been Tony Brown's thinking?
The change of name was quite straightforward, really. Lieutenant Governor had been there a long time as a title. We, as a Constitution Committee, wondered whether or not it was appropriate to continue with that name because it has an influence of it being, military. Lieutenant Governor, that's why they were originally here. The militia and the governor held the island under control. And we just felt, after doing quite a lot of research, and that research, we went and looked at what was going on in Canada, what went on in Australia, what went on in New Zealand. And there were some areas where they used the term Crown Commissioner. I think in the Isle of Man, there was a misunderstanding of that. They felt some didn't want the change, clearly. They were stoked up by some members of Tynwald who had in fact originally voted for it and then said, we shouldn't have this, which is Manx politics. And basically we got to the stage where there was a view about the whole thing as to whether or not it was really a big issue for the island. And clearly, on balance, the committee felt, it's not going to be the end of the world if we don't go with the change. We certainly were very much of the view it should have gone on. We don't think it would have diminished the role. People got confused here by Crown Commissioner with commissioners, and there's nothing at all that links to that. And he still would have, or she would have had the status of being the Crown's representative. It was a title. And we certainly felt there was a need to move away from the term Lieutenant Governor because it gives the inference of a military person, not a civilian person, basically. And it was not unique within the Commonwealth.
Well, that's a bit awkward. We've just said goodbye to a civilian governor, and the Manx Appointment Committee of the Chief Minister, the First Deemster and the President of Tynwald have now given the job to a military man. What would Tony Brown say to that?
And that's their responsibility, and time will tell.
So let's hear from a diplomat, a diplomatic governor. Sir Richard Gosney has just finished his 5-year term here on the island and finally left with his wife Diana after the August bank holiday weekend. I was able to speak with him before he left and asked him, what's he been doing?
It's a role that I'm not used to because it's a role that depends entirely on the Crown. In other words, the Lieutenant Governor is here as representative of the Queen and not of the British government. In the Crown dependencies, like the Isle of Man, the role of the Queen's representative is to represent the Queen, full stop. Most new legislation through Tynwald gets signed off by the Lieutenant Governor on behalf of the Queen. And also something that's come back into the frame in the last 2 or 3 years, nationality. We had a hard look at this and decided that the signing off of applications from third country nationals here in the Isle of Man. A lot of people, steady trickle of people from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from North America want to take British citizenship here. And the final sign-off on that, we decided, is best done by the Lieutenant Governor, and it is not quite safe to delegate it to officials in Isle of Man Cabinet Office. Not because the officials couldn't do it, because on a legal basis, it could be challenged. That means that the role is almost entirely to do what the organisations, people, clubs, veterans associations, charities, all the rest of them, would like the Queen's representative to do on the island. And we turn up, Diana and I, almost every time we can when someone asks us to do things.
Well, that's an interesting point, because if you look at the details of the job description for governor, you'll see, amongst other things, that the governor and their spouse can expect to be patrons of anything up to 100 local organisations. But surely this is not what we're paying £108,000 a year for. In fairness, the job description also requires that the governor is the personal representative of and impartial adviser to Her Majesty the Queen, Lord of Man. He must represent her on ceremonial occasions and host royal and VIP visits. He must carry out certain executive functions, such as the granting of royal assent and the delegated authority from the Queen. He must make recommendations for certain Crown appointments and must be a discreet and lucid communicator with and between the island's government, authorities and the UK government. Now, what precisely does that mean? What would the governor be communicating between here and the UK authorities?
If there was something deeply untoward happened here, or untoward sufficiently to I want to report up the chain, it would be to the Queen's private secretary and not to anyone else. And I can say that that hasn't happened in the 5 years. If it had happened, I'm not sure I'd tell you, but I wouldn't deny it. And I'm denying it because the Isle of Man has been on. And I mean, that's the sort of thing that happened more than 50 years ago when you got into a slight tangle over a certain radio ship that hove to off the waters here, that sort of thing. But I think since then there hasn't been a spat with the British government such that the Crown ought to be put in the picture. So that's good. And what that definition of spat would be is up to the Lieutenant Governor here, as in Guernsey and Jersey.
In one document, he's described as being the guardian of the affairs of the Queen or Crown matters. What does that mean? As guardian, is there a time when he'd have to intervene in our affairs?
I think without a written constitution, the only way to judge that is when instances come up. There is that debate about where the issue, how serious something would have to be for the question of the good governorship, the good government and governorship of the Isle of Man to come in. And that's not government or governorship by the Lieutenant Governor, of course, that's by the government. And if something got very serious, then the question would, if the Isle of Man was taken seriously off the rails, then that question would come up. Here.
And you'd be involved in that, would you?
I think so. I think you'd have to try and interpret some of that.
But he meets regularly with the Chief Minister, the First Deemster, the Chief Constable and the Attorney General. Why? What does he talk about?
I meet informally with these people. It's never on the formal diary, not every week, but regularly. Just to hear from them what's going on and what they're up to. Because if I'm going to make sense of the island to visitors or even remain intelligently informed about what's happening on the island, it's a good idea to hear from them. I never offer any advice. I mean, woe betide a Lieutenant Governor who said, well, why don't you do this, that or the other Chief Minister, Chief Constable? I think the usual retort of there's a boat in the morning would come through very quickly.
Well, that's very interesting, because I recall Mrs. Hannon telling me many years ago when she was Minister for Education that she was summoned to Government House to hear His Excellency's views on education.
Oh yes, I was summoned up by the governor, and he proceeded to tell me how I should be developing education. So I had to firmly tell him that it was for the me and the department, and not for him. He had no place in telling me what to do. But he did before he went. Or before he finished his term of office, he did say he'd enjoyed our discussions, and we used to have quite a few quite heated discussions at times with differences of opinion.
And did he actually have any useful ideas?
I don't think so, no.
That reminded me of another occasion many years ago when I happened to be standing next to Mrs. Hannon at the annual Tinwell garden party in the grounds of Government House, and suddenly there was a fly-past of military planes, low and loud. I'm absolutely sure it wasn't meant as such, but it did seem rather like a warning to the locals of what was on hand if we got a little above ourselves. Mrs. Hannon was outraged.
And I'm still outraged by what happens at Tinwald, having a fly past, having British troops over, which we paid for last year, not this year, last year, when we didn't have all of that pomp. And I thought it was a fantastic Tinwald Day. I thought it was wonderful. It was ours, and a lot of people didn't go because they were told not to. So there weren't that many people that experienced that, but it was a wonderful day. It was our Tinwald Day, not what we have now.
Another of the requirements in the Governor's job description, along with living in Government House, having a partner willing to live here and play their part, is to offer advice and support to the island authorities in dealing with civil emergencies. Well, in the past 2 years, we've had the greatest civil emergency since World War II, COVID. The government issued many orders under the 1936 Emergency Powers Act, and the governor had to scrutinise and sign these orders.
I did last year, when they found that the only way to do what they wanted to do, particularly in terms of the borders, was to invoke the, as you say, the 1936 Emergency Powers Act. That's something that the Lieutenant Governor has to sign off on the advice of the executive. I mean, it wasn't in 1936, there wasn't a Council of Ministers, of course, but the executive of the day, which wasn't difficult because that was chaired by the Lieutenant Governor all that time ago. And there was no other legal basis for it, so that I had to do every month for 3 months while that ran. And then the implementing regulations, once they'd been agreed by the Council of Ministers, also, according to the law, had to come for signature to me.
This raises an interesting issue. Would the governor refuse to sign one of these orders if he had reservations about it?
I always want to understand what I'm signing. It's a fairly good principle for anybody with a pen and a serious document in front of them. Once or twice I said, are you confident that the High Bailiff or Deputy High Bailiff will make clear sense of this if someone is held up? If you move the comma or you put in an extra conjunction, would that actually help? It was just on how that would be, how ease of interpretation. And it was diffidently done, and if they wanted to ignore me, they could ignore me.
There's a very interesting paragraph in Derek Winterbottom's book on the governors of the Isle of Man concerning a particular governor, and it raises an issue that perhaps few were aware of at the time. It concerned Air Marshal Ian McFadden, who described himself as a hands-on person who loved meeting people. He and his wife Sally were very popular with the Manx community at large. But it was just at a time, 20 years ago, when the Manx government was attempting to restrain and reduce the profile of governors, and his determination to be so fully involved sometimes led to tensions with senior politicians. It was just before Tony Brown became Chief Minister. Was he aware of the situation?
I was always of the view, and certainly practiced it when I was Chief Minister, that it was the role of the ministers and the Chief Minister, but predominantly the Chief Minister, to step into the role that used to be undertaken by the Governor many, many decades ago, and to be the person who represents the Isle of Man at dinners, at functions, at promotions and so on. But I do think the roles need to be very clear. The Governor has a role, and the Chief Minister and his ministers have another role. And it's not just being politicians, it's actually representing the people of the Isle of Man on the occasions where that's warranted. And I certainly developed that when I was Chief Minister, and was involved maybe 3 or 4 days in the evenings after days' work at functions, either making speeches, opening places, or doing whatever, or just going along to support organisations.
It was actually during Tony Brown's tenure that the Manx government drew up more specific guidelines concerning the governor's responsibilities. But the job description of the governor to be sworn in next week quite clearly outlines a busy community role. Doesn't this conflict with what the government was trying to achieve?
Well, I think it's important, but I think the difference is you should not allow, and I hope we don't go back to the time when people saw the only person that you involved was the governor. Those days are well gone, long gone. I mean, society has changed. Yes, the governor and his wife have a role to play, and that's fine. But I do think it's important that the lines of demarcation are very carefully monitored. The Chief Minister and his wife has an important role to play. Ministers and their wives have an important role to play. And I think, government should concentrate on those issues. And when it is appropriate, His Excellency should then be involved.
So how conscious had Sir Richard been of treading on ministers' toes and possibly becoming too popular?
It's up to the Chief Minister to decide how much or little he does, and the present Chief Minister has been doing a great deal. No, I'm always very conscious that I don't get I'm not up for re-election. I wasn't elected, and I'm not up for re-election. And to put it at its most blunt, I'll always try and avoid getting between the camera and one of the politicians who needs to be photographed in an event. And sometimes here I've suggested to the Chief Minister, and he's readily agreed, that we act as co-hosts. We did a couple of thank you receptions almost a year ago after the first lockdown, September 2020, and Howard and Lorraine Quayle and Diana and I did it. The invitations went out from the four of us, and we both spoke when all the people. These are the people who'd done heavy duty and hard work beyond the call of duty, in both from government and from the charities during that difficult period of the spring and the summer.
So receptions, visits around the island, patronage of societies. Really, is there actually enough for the governor to do? Tony Brown.
Well, whether or not there's enough for the governor to do, I suppose, is a matter of conjecture. I mean, the point is, you hear people say, well, we're paying a lot of money for somebody to do nothing. Well, in fact, he's not doing nothing. He's representing the Crown in the Isle of Man. And by the British structure, that will always happen. It's not long ago we didn't set out on paper what the role of the governor was, and that did cause confusion, and that was brought in to try and make sure both parties knew where they stood, i.e. council ministers, chief minister, and then the governor. So I think that's to be welcomed. I think what's important is the wording to make sure you don't give the impression to somebody from the United Kingdom that in fact he's got a bigger role than he has. Reporting back, overseeing us, they're not really. There's a role, and that role is being dealt with in the way it's set up. If we want to change that role, you go independent. We're not independent, but if you did go the full road of independence, the likelihood is the Isle of Man, if the people so decided to go independent, would still stay with the Crown, have a link to the Crown. I think that's without doubt clear. And you would still then have a Lieutenant Governor or a person appointed by the Queen to represent the Isle of Man.
So it would seem for the moment there is little appetite for a major constitutional change. No severing of the dependency on the United Kingdom. For the foreseeable future, the governor's role as the representative of the Crown here on the island will continue, and the swearing-in ceremony in Castle Rushen next week will be the latest in a long line of such ceremonies, which many will see as a symbol of stability and continuity at a time when such qualities are in short supply in many places around the world. And so the final word to our historian, Derek Winterbottom, who's quite clear that our association with the Queen and all that entails is hugely to the advantage of the island.
It's enormously to the advantage because the Queen is unquestionably one of the most famous people in the world, and moreover, it makes it clear to international communities, to possible investors, that the island is a democratically run, stable government, and that has got to be enormously to the advantage of the island.